At 3:30 in the morning, Sarah stared at the blank text message field, hands trembling. Her baby's cries echoed in the next room, and the last drops of formula in the cupboard were gone. She typed a desperate plea, $50 for baby food, meant for her brother, and hit send before she could second-guess herself. Only later did she realize she'd dialed the wrong number. What she didn't know was that the message landed in the hands of Victor Carrington, one of America's richest men, a recluse who rarely answered his phone. And what happened next set off a chain of events that would expose hidden grief, test lines between charity and control, and force both of them to reckon with truths they never wanted revealed. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Sarah had no idea that a single mistaken text could reach a man like Victor Carrington, a billionaire whose name rarely left the business pages and whose private life was locked behind the gates of sprawling estates. But instead of ignoring it, Victor paused, his thumb hovering over the screen, gripped by a message that seemed far too raw to be a scam. Why did he, a man surrounded by wealth and power, choose to answer a plea from a stranger? What memories stirred in him that night when he read Sarah's words? And what hidden motives would shape every decision he made after? The truth would not just change Sarah's life, but shake Victor's world as well, exposing a story no one on the outside could have imagined. A wrong number, a desperate mother, and a billionaire who could not look away. What came next would leave everyone questioning where kindness ends and something far more complicated begins. Sarah was 27, a single mother raising her son alone in a neighborhood where the streetlights flickered and opportunity seemed like a cruel joke. She worked shifts at a corner store that barely covered rent, and when the bills piled up, she often skipped meals so her child wouldn't. There were nights she sat by the window clutching a worn baby blanket, wondering how she had become so invisible in a city full of people rushing past her. Yet even in her exhaustion, her resilience never faltered. Every morning she whispered promises to her son that one day life would be better, even if she had no idea how. To the world, she was just another face in a crowd. But in the quiet of her small apartment, she was a fighter, a mother desperate to protect her child, even if it meant reaching out in a moment of desperation to what she thought was family. Victor Carrington, on the other hand, lived in a world so far removed from Sarah's that it almost seemed like another planet. A billionaire many times over, he was the head of Carrington Global, a sprawling empire that touched everything from pharmaceuticals to real estate. His face appeared in glossy magazines, smiling next to politicians and celebrities, yet few truly knew him. What the public celebrated as philanthropy was, to him, often an attempt to quiet the loneliness that wealth could never fill. Years earlier, he had lost his wife to illness, and though time had dulled the sharpest edges of grief, the silence of his grand estate was a reminder of what money could never buy back. Behind the walls of privilege, Victor was haunted by absence, by the life that might have been, by the child he and his wife never had. And perhaps that was why Sarah's message stopped him cold that night. It was past 3 in the morning when Sarah finally sat on the edge of her bed, exhausted and trembling, with her son's cries echoing down the narrow hallway. The night felt endless, and the cupboards were bare. She had already called her brother earlier that week for help, ashamed to ask again, but desperation has a way of silencing pride. Her hands shook as she typed, $50, just enough for baby food until payday. She didn't pause to check the number, didn't look twice before pressing send. For her, the act was a lifeline thrown into the dark, a final hope that someone she trusted might pull her back from drowning. But on the other side of the city, where marble floors stretched across silent rooms and wealth guarded a man from the world outside, it wasn't her brother who saw the glow of the screen. It was Victor Carrington. Victor had grown accustomed to ignoring the constant buzz of his phone. Requests for meetings, offers, demands. They filled his days with noise he no longer cared for. But that night, perhaps by chance, perhaps by something deeper he could not name, he glanced at the unfamiliar number. The message was short, almost abrupt. a mother asking for $50 to buy food for her baby. His first instinct was suspicion. With his wealth, scams arrived by the dozen, all dressed in sorrow. Yet something about this one caught him differently. The words were too raw, too unpolished, written by someone who didn't have time to craft a lie. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling, remembering nights when he and his late wife had spoken of children they never had, imagining what it might have been like to wake to the cries of a baby depending on him. He could not look away. Minutes passed before Victor typed a reply. A part of him wanted to ignore it, to delete the message, and dismiss it as yet another attempt to reach his fortune. But the silence of his home, the absence of voices, pressed on him until the screen seemed to demand an answer. Instead of asking questions, instead of pushing the matter away, he opened his banking app. He didn't send $50. He didn't send $100. He sent $5,000 with a single press, a sum that to him meant nothing but to a struggling mother could mean the difference between despair and survival. Sarah, still rocking her son, felt her phone vibrate, and when she looked down, her eyes widened. The number she had messaged was not her brother's, but the money sitting in her account was real. What seemed like an act of kindness was only the beginning. For Sarah, the relief was immediate, overwhelming. She laughed and cried at the same time, clutching her child close, unable to believe that the cruel world she had come to know could also deliver a miracle. But for Victor, the act did not close a door, it opened one. He found himself wondering about her, about the life behind those few desperate words. Who was this woman who reached out into the night? Why did her needs strike him so personally when he had ignored countless other requests? And most troubling of all, what did it mean for him to step into her life so suddenly, with wealth she had never dreamed of? But what seemed like kindness soon unraveled into something no one expected, a story that would blur the line between generosity and control, between desperation and destiny, and neither Sarah nor Victor would ever be the same again. The morning after the transfer, Sarah stood in the cramped aisle of a grocery store, clutching a cart filled higher than it had ever been before. Neighbors who once passed her by without a glance suddenly asked where she had found such fortune. But it was not long before her story escaped the walls of her neighborhood. One local reporter picked up the thread, curious about a struggling mother who had received an extraordinary sum from an unknown benefactor. Within days, headlines blared across the nation. Billionaire saves poor mother by mistake. Talk shows debated it, radio hosts speculated, and social media ignited with praise and doubt alike. For Sarah, life shifted overnight. Her once anonymous existence was thrust into the spotlight, and strangers she had never met sent donations, messages of encouragement, and promises of help. What had begun as desperation was quickly becoming a national obsession. For Victor Carrington, however, the story took a far different turn. At first, his name was not revealed. Reporters described him only as a reclusive billionaire who had reached into his pocket for a stranger. But in an age where no secret holds for long, it wasn't difficult for journalists to piece the details together. Soon, his face was splashed across screens. Victor Carrington, America's reluctant Samaritan. The public reaction was immediate, but not uniform. To some, he was a hero, proof that compassion still existed at the highest levels of society. To others, he was a manipulator. Questions arose quickly. Why so much more than she asked? Was this generosity, or was there an unspoken bargain hiding beneath the surface? Analysts dissected his history, his company, and even his late wife's tragic death, searching for patterns that might explain the unexplainable. Suddenly, Victor's carefully guarded privacy was slipping away. Rumors began to multiply, feeding on each other like flames in dry grass. Some claimed Victor had staged the event as a publicity stunt, desperate to polish his image after whispers of corruption in his business empire. Others suggested Sarah had been planted, that the wrong text was nothing more than a crafted story to draw sympathy and distract from darker truths. Conspiracy forums lit up with speculation, pointing to supposed leaked documents and questionable emails circulating online. Screenshots, some real, many fabricated, spread spread across social media, alleging everything from exploitation to blackmail. Each day brought new theories. Was Sarah a victim or a willing accomplice? Was Victor a savior or a man playing a dangerous game behind the curtain of wealth? For every person who defended him, another tore his motives apart, and the line between truth and fabrication blurred until it seemed no one could tell the difference. Detective-style questions dominated nightly broadcasts. Anchors leaned forward asking, "What really happened here?" Investigative journalists pieced together timelines, hunting through public records, analyzing text transcripts, and digging into Sarah's past. Had she truly sent the message by mistake, or was there evidence of prior contact? Experts debated endlessly. Psychologists spoke about desperation, while financial analysts examined Victor's companies for hidden motives. The public grew divided. To some, Sarah embodied resilience and innocence, a struggling mother caught in circumstances beyond her control. To others, she became a symbol of opportunism, someone who perhaps understood the power of attention in a media-driven world. Victor's image followed the same split. Was he a saint unwillingly dragged into the light, or a calculating figure using compassion as a shield? Every headline, every interview, every leaked report seemed to deepen the mystery rather than solve it, ensuring that the questions grew louder with time. For weeks, the headlines painted Victor Carrington as either a saint or a schemer, but the truth of his actions went back much further than anyone imagined. Long before the towers of Carrington Global bore his name, before the billions and the boardrooms, Victor had known hunger himself. In his early 20s, estranged from his family and bankrupt from a failed venture, he found himself sleeping in his car during a bitter winter. One evening, when the cold threatened to consume him, a stranger pressed a steaming cup of coffee into his hands and offered him shelter. It was a small act, one easily forgotten by the world, but it carved itself into Victor's memory. That night, he had learned that survival sometimes hinges on a single act of compassion. Years later, when Sarah's message lit up his phone, the echo of that long-ago kindness returned to him with startling force. Yet there was something even more intimate that stirred within Victor as he studied Sarah's words. Her message had ended with the name of her son, Micah. For most, it would have been just another name, but for Victor it was a wound reopened. He and his late wife had once chosen the same name for the child they dreamed of, a child who never came into their lives. His wife's illness had taken that future from them, leaving him with hollow rooms and silences too heavy to bear. So when he read the name Micah glowing on his screen, it was not coincidence he saw. It was memory, grief, and longing colliding all at once. The reason he sent far more than Sarah asked was not generosity alone. It was redemption, an attempt to give to another child what he had been denied. In Sarah's plea, he heard his wife's voice echoing back. As the public speculated wildly about motives, Victor remained silent, refusing interviews, leaving only fragments for others to interpret. But inside his estate, he wrestled with emotions he could no longer suppress. Sarah's story drew him in not as a headline but as a mirror. He had lived with wealth that solved everything and nothing at all, but the hollow ache of loss never left. Now here was a mother, fighting to keep her son alive with nothing but determination and a text message mistakenly sent to him. It was as though fate had delivered him a chance to confront the ghosts of his past. In Sarah's desperation, he saw his own once fragile survival, and in Micah's eyes, he began to see the child he and his wife had only dreamed of. What others called scandal or spectacle was, for Victor, a reckoning he could not turn away from. For Sarah, the revelation came not from headlines, but from a quiet conversation months later. When she finally asked him why 5,000, why her, Victor's reply was stripped of the grandeur often associated with men of his stature. He spoke of a winter long ago, of hunger and mercy, and of a name that bound him to a future he had lost. His voice cracked when he mentioned his wife, when he admitted that sometimes he still set a place for her at the dining table out of habit. Sarah listened, tears in her eyes, realizing that the man the world painted as untouchable had scars deeper than anyone imagined. What had begun as a wrong number was no longer about money. It was about grief, about memory, about two lives unexpectedly intertwined by chance. And as Victor looked at Micah, he saw not only Sarah's son, but the hope of healing. At first, Sarah feared that the storm of attention would swallow her whole, that she and her son would forever be defined by a wrong number and the generosity of a stranger. But Victor Carrington chose a different path, one that surprised her and silenced much of the public debate. Instead of endless gifts, he offered her something far more lasting: a job. Sarah was brought into Carrington Global, not as a face for publicity, but as a staff member whose grit and resilience impressed him more than any resume ever could. The adjustment was not easy. Sarah had never worked in an office tower, never seen floors of glass and steel that stretched into the clouds. But she learned quickly. Victor insisted she be treated as any other employee, with training, responsibilities, and a salary that allowed her, for the first time, to breathe without fear of bills piling higher than her hope. Within months, Sarah moved into a modest but beautiful home of her own, one with steady light, a safe neighborhood, and space for Micah to grow. For Sarah, it was not charity, it was a second chance, one earned with effort. For Victor, it was not control, it was redemption, giving someone else the future he had once dreamed of but lost. The relationship between them shifted from rescuer and rescued to something steadier: mentor and protege, two people bound not by debt, but by opportunity. And with every paycheck, Sarah's independence grew stronger, her dignity intact. Sarah's story with Victor Carrington began with desperation, but it ended with transformation. A mistaken text became the bridge to a life where she could provide for Micah without fear, where she could stand on her own 2 feet, not as a symbol of pity, but as a woman who had carved out stability from chaos. She was no longer the mother hiding behind flickering streetlights, but a homeowner, a provider, and an example to every parent who had ever whispered promises to their child in the dark. For Victor, the story was no less profound. In hiring Sarah, he did more than change her circumstances. He changed his own. The hollow rooms of his estate no longer felt so empty, the silence of grief no longer so heavy. In Sarah's determination and Micah's laughter, he found echoes of the family he had once lost, and in giving her opportunity, he rediscovered purpose. So now we turn the question to you. If you received a text like Sarah's that night, would you have answered? Would you have looked past suspicion to see humanity in the words? And if you were Sarah, would you have taken the risk to reach out, not knowing what future might unfold? Sometimes, the smallest mistake can change everything, not into chains, but into freedom. A wrong number built a new beginning, not just for Sarah and Micah, but for Victor as well. Before you go, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next story that may just change how you see the world.